To take you over to our top story this hour. New evidence today that the Taliban may have actually tried to prevent 9/11. That's right, new U.S. State Department documents show a rocky relationship between Osama bin Laden and Taliban leader Mullah Mohammad Omar. Gareth Porter, investigative journalist, has been following these new developments, and he joins us now live in our D.C. studios. So Gareth, you recently wrote this interesting piece that suggests that there was in fact a rift between Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden. What evidence do you have of this? Can you elaborate on it?
Sure. What I found is that there are a variety of sources now that, when you look at the entire record, begin to show a very different picture of the relationship that existed from 1996, but particularly after 1998 to 2001, between Mullah Omar's Taliban regime and Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. What we see now is that from the beginning, Osama bin Laden was able to stay in Afghanistan only because he had agreed to two conditions imposed on him by Mullah Omar. First, no meeting with the foreign press, national or foreign media, without the express approval of the Taliban regime, and two, no plotting against the United States. Why? Because the Taliban regime was very much aware that the United States could strike at the regime and threaten its existence. So they established those two conditions from the very beginning, and this was confirmed to me by the former foreign minister of the Taliban regime, Mr. Mutawakil, who is now one of the mediators between Karzai and the Taliban, so he's really no longer associated with the Taliban specifically. The other thing that we find is that there were moves by the Taliban regime after 1998's bombing of the two American embassies in East Africa, which really clamped down on bin Laden. And these have been forgotten now, I'm afraid, in the rush by the Obama administration to suggest that Mullah Omar and the Taliban regime have the blood of thousands of Americans on their hands, as Robert Gates' spokesman said a few weeks ago.
Well, why do you think that is? Because you're right, that what you're talking about here, this evidence contradicts completely what the Obama administration says.
Well, I think on one hand, you've got short historical memories. Some of this evidence comes from the New York Times in March 1999, reporting on an incident in which the Taliban had imposed new restrictions on bin Laden, taken away his satellite phone, and surrounded him with their own personnel, taken away his own Arab bodyguards. So he was very unhappy with that. This was reported in the New York Times based on what both Taliban and U.S. officials were saying at the time. So I think that there's been some American officials who've forgotten what they had read in the New York Times perhaps a decade ago. But secondly, I think this serves the purpose of those people in the Obama administration who really don't want negotiations with the Taliban. I think this is one of their arguments. And this is a divided administration. There are some people, Hillary Clinton, perhaps Robert Gates as well, who are not in favor of negotiations, at least not for quite a while. And I think there are others in the administration who think that it's time to really start talking about negotiations now.
But it's interesting that you point that out, because if Taliban statements in recent months are saying, look, we have no interest in al-Qaeda's global jihadist aims, then who is fighting who here? Because you said the administration is divided, and we talk a lot about the good Taliban versus the bad Taliban. So what's going on over here?
Yeah, it's not a question of good Taliban versus bad Taliban. It's the question of whether the Taliban are in conflict with al-Qaeda's global jihadi agenda or not. And I think the evidence that I have put together in this article really corroborates what the Taliban have been saying in recent months, which is that, hey, our objectives are nationalist in Afghanistan itself. We want to have an end to the foreign occupation, and we want to have Sharia law in Afghanistan, but we're not interested in striking other countries outside of Afghanistan.
Well, speaking of foreign occupation, I do want to talk to you about the recent offensive in Marja. We found out that there were at least 15 civilian casualties after that, and we talk a lot about this notion of the U.S. winning the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. Very difficult to do that when we hear these news. A lot of experts have raised the question of whether or not the United States is committing major war crimes over there, whether or not it's essentially complying with international law by doing this. What is your take on it?
Well, I think thus far we haven't seen the kind of war crimes that certainly I remember from the Vietnam War. Or from...
Does that make it okay?
It doesn't make it okay, but what I'm saying is that I think the real crimes here are taking place outside the viewpoint of the the international media covering this offensive. What we have is a reduction in the use of air power in Afghanistan in the last year or so, 6 months, but an increase in night raids, breaking into people's homes, picking up people, detaining them indefinitely. These are the kinds of things that I think are upsetting Afghans. I expect we are going to see that happening in Marja and the area surrounding that city in the coming months. That's what's going to be happening beyond the eye of the camera and outside the view of reporters covering this offense.
Wow, that's a very interesting point, and we actually have been covering those night raids and also the secret prisons. Investigative journalist Gareth Porter, thank you as always for your analysis.